it was a great movie, but
Yeah.
it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
It was one of the most talked about films of the century, and more than 2 decades after it hit theaters, people are still arguing about it. So when Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan, it wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was a chance to hear, straight from a man who made it, what really went into building the passion of the Christ, and what comes next. The conversation covered a lot of ground. Faith, the Catholic Church, Gibson's own history with addiction, and the long-awaited sequel he's been developing for years. But the parts that lit up the internet were the ones where Gibson talked about what happened behind the camera, the pain, the sacrifice, and the strange things that occurred on set that even the people who lived through them still bring up today. The Passion of the Christ was never a safe project. Gibson wasn't chasing box office numbers or awards buzz. He wanted to make something that forced audiences to sit with the weight of what they were watching, rather than something polished and easy to look away from. He spent years studying the Gospels before writing a single scene, trying to understand not just the events of Christ's final hours, but the meaning behind them. The film opens in the Garden of Gethsemane, with Jesus in anguish before his arrest, a moment meant to establish, right away, that this wouldn't be a distant, reverent retelling. It would be intimate and uncomfortable. Getting the film made at all turned out to be its own battle. Traditional studios weren't interested, and Gibson ended up financing the project himself. Despite the doubts from the industry, the film went on to become one of the highest-grossing R-rated releases ever made. Site index equals 17-1 and remains, according to Looper, one of the highest-grossing films about religion in history, /site. A lot of what made the film so visceral wasn't achieved with visual effects. It came from what Jim Caviezel, the actor who played Jesus, actually went through during production. Caviezel has spoken about this repeatedly in the years since, and the details are hard to forget. While filming the scourging sequence, a cross weighing more than 150 pounds fell on him during a take. As he described it afterward, site index equals 18-1, it struck him and buried his head, and he bit through his tongue and cheek/site, an injury that ended up captured on camera and used in the finished film. He also dislocated his left shoulder during filming and struggled with it for the rest of the shoot, according to his own recollections in multiple interviews. Then there's the story that's followed the film for 20 years. Caviezel says he was struck by lightning while shooting the Sermon on the Mount scene. He's described feeling it coming just before it happened, and witnesses on set reportedly said they saw light around him in the moment it struck. Site index equals 17-1. He later needed 2 heart surgeries, including an open heart procedure, which he has attributed to the aftereffects of that strike. /site, the assistant director on the film, was reportedly struck as well during the same period of shooting, though accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Caviezel has always framed these injuries as part of what made the performance real. In his view, a controlled, comfortable shoot in a studio wouldn't have produced the same result on screen. The suffering audiences see is, in part, suffering that actually happened. When the film reached theaters, reactions split hard. Roger Ebert, one of the most influential critics in American film history, gave it a full 4 stars, calling it the most violent film he'd ever seen. High praise, in his framing, for a movie that succeeded at making its audience feel the weight of what it depicted. But the film also drew serious criticism. Religious scholars and leaders raised concerns before release that certain scenes could reinforce old harmful stereotypes with a long and ugly history of being used to justify anti-Semitism. Gibson maintained that the film's point was collective responsibility for the crucifixion, not blame directed at any one group. But the debate around that question has never fully gone away, and it's worth noting that Gibson's own public history, including anti-Semitic remarks he made during a 2006 arrest, has kept that scrutiny alive. Some of what appears in the film also isn't drawn directly from Scripture. Scenes involving Satan appearing to tempt Jesus in the garden, for instance, reflect Gibson's own interpretive choices rather than a word-for-word translation of the Gospels. Gibson has described this as intentional artistic license, meant to dramatize spiritual themes rather than serve as a documentary reconstruction. During his conversation with Rogan, Gibson connected the resistance he faced to a broader pattern he says he's noticed in the industry. That stories from various faith traditions tend to get more careful, sympathetic treatment than stories rooted in Christianity, which he feels are more often dismissed outright. Whether or not people agree with that read, it's clearly part of why he describes making the first film as a fight rather than a straightforward production. The part of the interview that generated the most headlines wasn't about the past. It was about what's coming next. Gibson confirmed that he and screenwriter Randall Wallace, along with Gibson's brother Donald, have been developing a sequel titled The Resurrection of the Christ. Site index equals 5-1 for roughly 7 years. Site. Gibson didn't hold back on how ambitious the project is. Describing the film to Rogan, site index equals for -1, he said the story goes back to the fall of the angels /site, meaning the film won't simply pick up where the passion left off at the resurrection itself, but will reach much further back into the cosmic and spiritual history that Gibson sees as the backdrop to that moment. He's described the script as unlike anything he's worked with before, calling it something closer to site index equals for -1, an acid trip, /site in terms of how unconventional its structure and imagery are. Site index equals 6-1. Wallace has said the film goes from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle /site, a scope that would put the sequel's timeline far outside the 12 hours the original film covered. Wallace, who has worked with Gibson on films including Braveheart and Hacksaw Ridge, said the idea for a resurrection-focused film wasn't originally Gibson's. Site index equals 6-1. Wallace has said he was the one who approached Gibson about it /site, having thought about the subject for years after their work together on other projects. On the podcast, Gibson also talked about his own view of the resurrection, not as a matter of faith alone, but as something he considers historically documented. Site index equals 7-1. He's pointed to the fact that the apostles all died for what they claim to have witnessed /site as evidence that, in his view, supports the historical reality of the events described in the Gospels. There have been some changes to the project since it was first announced. Jim Caviezel was originally expected to reprise his role, but reports have cited scheduling conflicts and challenges with de-aging technology as reasons the production ultimately moved forward with a different actor in the lead role. Production has reportedly wrapped after roughly 4.5 months of filming across multiple locations in Italy, including Rome and several smaller towns in the south of the country. Gibson has said he hopes to begin the next phase of the project in the near future, and Lionsgate has already set plans in motion. The original Passion of the Christ is set for a remastered theatrical re-release in September, positioned as a lead-in to the new film, with The Resurrection of the Christ, Part 1 slated to arrive in theaters in 2027. None of what Gibson shared with Rogan was really a single bombshell revelation. It was the accumulation of it. The years of resistance he says he faced just to get the first film made. The real physical toll the production took on its lead actor. The theological ambition behind a script that reportedly stretches from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. And Gibson's own conviction that he's telling something more than a story. Whether or not someone shares Gibson's faith or agrees with his read on how the industry treats religious films, it's clear the conversation touched a nerve. The Passion of the Christ remains one of the most divisive and commercially successful films ever made about a religious subject, and more than 20 years later, people are still debating what it got right, what it got wrong, and what Gibson is about to attempt with the story that comes next. That's the real story behind the headlines. Not a hidden secret Hollywood tried to bury, but a filmmaker who spent decades chasing one story he believes matters more than anything else he's made, and who now says he's finally ready to finish telling it.